Mr. Robert Walter, thank you so much for this interview. You are well known here as the one who repeatedly proposed the Russia's exclusion from the Parliamentary Assembly and even from the Council of Europe. However, in your view, the dialogue with Russia, with the Russian delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly must continue. My question to you would be, is this feasible? The Russian deputies refuse to come to Strasbourg. In Ukraine, the conflict is going on, and Crimea has not been returned yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me correct you to start with. I never called for the Russians to be expelled from the Council of Europe. I always believed that we should take sanctions against the Russian delegation, because it was the Russian delegation which had been the enthusiastic supporters of Russia's policy in Ukraine, and particularly the annexation of Crimea. In terms of dialogue, the opportunities for dialogue have been there for the last year and a half. The Russian delegation is entitled to come and attend committee meetings, to attend the Assembly, to speak in the Assembly, and to give us their point of view. But they have failed to do that, and I think that's regrettable. Obviously, they feel that their position is such that they don't want to come and explain their position. And I think that we're all the poorer for it, both the Russians and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe.
None of the Russian delegates, as you mentioned, attends the current Assembly session. Is this good? Is this bad for the Assembly, for the legislative process, for the peace process in Ukraine, for the refugee crisis?
Well, we had a debate on the refugee crisis yesterday. I made the point that I believe that the West, the rest of Europe, the United States, should be talking to Russia, because Russia has an interest, particularly in Syria, with large military bases there, supplying weapons to the Assad regime. Incidentally, I also think we should be talking to the Assad regime, which is Russian policy, and how great it would be if our Russian deputies were here so that we could have that dialogue. We could talk to them about the way forward in fighting the real evil, which is ISIL.
Let's switch to the UN General Assembly. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko has accused Moscow of exploiting its veto power on the UN Security Council. The UN gives Russia, and I will quote, a license to kill, said Poroshenko. Could we say that by not punishing Russia enough, some would say, for its actions in Ukraine, the Council of Europe and the Parliamentary Assembly are also giving Russia a license to kill?
Well, no, Russia is in breach of its obligations under the UN Charter. It's in breach of its obligations as a member of the Council of Europe. It's in breach of international law by its occupation of Crimea, by its military intervention in eastern Ukraine. That is absolutely clear. In terms of more sanctions, more punishment, I'm not sure what else it is we can do. What I think we need to do is to bring Russia to the conference table, to make Russia feel that it is involved in the process of finding a resolution to the situation in Ukraine and particularly in Crimea. But more particularly, I think the West and Russia should be working together in some of the wider international questions, and Syria, as we've just mentioned, is one of those.
Getting back to the UN General Assembly, this was Putin's first appearance at the UN General Assembly in a decade. What is the meaning? What is the significance of it?
Well, I hope it's significant in the sense that President Putin feels he needs to re-engage. I understand, in fact, I've seen pictures of him toasting with President Obama at a dinner given by the Secretary General, and I understand that the two of them are going to meet together for discussions. And I think that's progress, and I think it must lead to a better resolution of some of the international disputes that we in the West have with our Russian friends and colleagues.
Mr. Walter, what do you think is Moscow's goal in Syria?
I think that Moscow probably wants to maintain a presence in the Eastern Mediterranean for strategic reasons, and that's one of its goals. I think its second goal is, if it's going to maintain that kind of presence, it needs either the Assad regime or it needs another government in Syria which would be willing to allow that situation to continue, which means that Russia's position is that it is as opposed to ISIL as we are in the West, which is why I think we should be working together.
For weeks, Russian state television has been shifting the focus from Ukraine to Syria. What should we understand from this? Why is that now?
Well, the Russians, as far as I'm concerned, have an indefensible position in Ukraine, but they do have a defensible position in their attitude towards Syria. And it may be that President Putin will be able, if he does have a discussion with President Obama, if we do get some cooperation between Russia and the Western forces, the Western coalition, which is fighting against ISIL, that President Putin can then demonstrate domestically that he has scored a diplomatic success.
Moscow's military presence in Syria is one of its biggest developments outside the former Soviet Union since the country's 1999 demise. Should the world be concerned about this?
Well, the world should be concerned, but the world should also want to work with Russia because if we do work together, then that Russian military presence in Syria can be used to our advantage against the real evil, which is ISIL and Al-Qaeda.
Because you mentioned the refugee crisis debate which took place here at the Parliamentary Assembly. You has taken the most of refugees' burden. What about Russia, the former Soviet countries? Here at the Parliamentary Assembly, you have the best platform to engage also those non-EU countries into the refugee crisis. Do you
I think
act in this way?
I think everybody has a responsibility to deal with the refugee crisis, which is a pretty catastrophic situation. I mean, Turkey has taken 2 million refugees, Lebanon, Jordan, right on the front line. But most of the other refugees who have moved across Europe want to go to Germany or Austria or Belgium or Sweden. Russia has taken very few. The only country of the former Soviet Union that I know of that's taken any significant number is Armenia.
Which is such a small country.
Which is a small country, but on the other hand, there were a large number of ethnic Armenians living in Syria. I think some 300,000 or 400,000 ethnic Armenians living in Syria.
Mr. Walter, thank you so much for this interview.
Okay, thank you.